Good evening. I'm Jason Calvert, and welcome to the Historytellers. Tonight, we conclude our three-part series on the beginnings of the New World. The inevitable clash between the emerging European superpowers would cross the Atlantic Ocean to engulf and destroy the civilizations already living on the American continents. We start our show tonight with Rebecca McMurrin, reporting on consequences that result when worlds collide.
Looking back in time, it's easy to point fingers and assign blame. After all, hindsight is 20/20. If history can tell us anything, it's that we seem doomed to repeat the very same mistakes over and over again. Such was the case on that fateful day in 1492 when two ecosystems commingled and clashed as Columbus waded ashore. The reverberations from that historic encounter have echoed for over the centuries since. The flora and fauna of the Old and New Worlds had been separated for thousands of years. European explorers marveled at the strange sights that greeted them, including exotic beasts such as iguanas and rattlesnakes. Native New World plants such as tobacco, maize, beans, tomatoes, and especially the lowly potato eventually revolutionized the international economy as well as the European diet, feeding the rapid population growth of the Old World. These foods were among the most important Indian gifts to the Europeans and to the rest of the world. Perhaps 3/5 of the crops cultivated around the globe today originated in the Americas. Ironically, the introduction into Africa of New World foods like maize, manioc, and sweet potatoes may have fed an African population boom that numerically, though not morally, more than offset the losses inflicted by the slave trade. In exchange, the Europeans introduced Old World crops and animals to the Americas. Columbus returned to the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, present-day Haiti and the Dominican Republic, in 1493 with 17 ships that unloaded 1,200 men and a virtual Noah's Ark of cattle, swine, and horses. The horses soon reached the North American mainland through Mexico and in less than 2 centuries had spread as far as Canada. North American Indian tribes like the Apaches, Sioux, and Blackfoot swiftly adopted the horse, transforming their cultures into highly mobile, wide-ranging hunter societies that roamed the grassy Great Plains in pursuit of the shaggy buffalo. Columbus also brought seedlings of sugar cane, which thrived in the warm Caribbean climate. A sugar revolution consequently took place in the European diet, fueled by the forced migration of millions of Africans to work the cane fields and sugar mills of the New World. Unwittingly, the Europeans also brought other organisms in the dirt on their boots and the dust on their clothes, such as the seeds of Kentucky bluegrass, dandelions, and daisies. Most ominous of all, in their bodies they carried the germs that cause smallpox, yellow fever, and malaria. Indeed, Old World diseases would quickly devastate the Native Americans. During the Indians' millennia of isolation in the Americas, most of the Old World's killer maladies had disappeared from among them. But generations of freedom from those illnesses had also wiped out protective antibodies. Devoid of natural resistance to Old World sicknesses, Indians died in droves. Within 50 years of the Spanish arrival, the population of the Taino natives in Hispaniola dwindled from some 1 million people to about 200. Enslavement and armed aggression took their toll, but the deadliest killers were microbes, not muskets. The lethal germ spread among the New World peoples with the speed and force of a hurricane, swiftly sweeping far ahead of the human invaders. Most of those afflicted never laid eyes on a European. In the centuries after Columbus's landfall, as many as 90% of the Native Americans perished, a demographic catastrophe without parallel in human history. This depopulation was surely not intended by the Spanish, but it was nevertheless so severe that entire cultures and ancient ways of life were extinguished forever. Baffled, enraged, and vengeful, Indian slaves sometimes kneaded tainted blood into their masters' bread, to little effect. Perhaps it was poetic justice that the Indians unintentionally did take a kind of revenge by infecting the early explorers with syphilis, injecting that lethal sexually transmitted disease for the first time into Europe. I'm Rebecca McMurrin, reporting for the Historytellers.
Thank you, Rebecca. There is a phrase, money will make the world go around. This phrase implies that everything we do as individuals, as cultures, as nations is motivated by accumulation of wealth. While you can certainly point to many altruistic interests throughout history, it is impossible to look at the European conquest of the Americas without analyzing the accumulation of wealth as the primary motivating factor. Very quickly, Europeans realized that the American continents held rich prizes, especially the gold and silver of the advanced Indian civilizations in Mexico and Peru. Spain secured its claim to Columbus's discovery, in the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, dividing with Portugal the heathen lands of the New World. The lion's share went to Spain, but Portugal received compensating territory in Africa and Asia, as well as title to lands that one day would be Brazil. Spain became the dominant exploring and colonizing power in the 1500s. In the service of God, as well as in search of gold and glory, Spanish conquerors fanned out across the Caribbean and eventually onto the mainland of the American continents. On Spain's long roster of notable deeds, two spectacular exploits must be headlined. Vasco Núñez Balboa, hailed as the discoverer of the Pacific Ocean, waded into the foaming waves off Panama in 1513 and boldly claimed for his king all the lands washed by that sea. Ferdinand Magellan started from Spain in 1519 with 5 tiny ships. After beating through the storm-lashed strait off the tip of South America, that still bears his name, he was slain by the inhabitants of the Philippines. His one remaining vessel creaked home in 1522, completing the first circumnavigation of the globe. Other ambitious Spaniards ventured into North America. In 1513 and 1521, Juan Ponce de Leon explored Florida, which he at first thought was an island. Seeking gold, and probably not the mythical fountain of youth, he instead met with death by an Indian arrow. In 1540 to 1542 Francisco Coronado, in search of fabled golden cities that turned out to be adobe pueblos, wandered with a clanking cavalcade through Arizona and New Mexico, penetrating as far east as Kansas. En route his expedition discovered several awesome natural wonders, the Grand Canyon, the Colorado River, and enormous herds of buffalo. Hernán de Soto, with 600 armor-plated men, undertook a fantastic gold-seeking expedition during 1539 to 1542. Floundering through marshes and pine barrens from Florida westward, he discovered and crossed the majestic Mississippi River just north of its junction with the Arkansas River. After brutally mistreating the Indians with iron collars and fierce dogs, he at length died of fever and wounds. His troops secretly disposed of his remains at night in the Mississippi, lest the Indians exhume and abuse his corpse. Meanwhile in South America, the iron-fisted conqueror Francisco Pizarro crushed the Incas of Peru in 1532 and added a huge hoard of loot to Spanish coffers. By 1600 Spain was swimming in New World silver, mostly from the fabulously rich mines at Potosí and present-day Bolivia, as well as from Mexico. This flood of precious metal touched off a price revolution in Europe that increased consumer costs by as much as 500% in the 100 years after the mid-16th century. Some scholars see in this ballooning European money supply the fuel that fed the growth of the economic system known as capitalism. Certainly, New World bullion helped transform the world economy. It swelled the vaults of bankers from Spain to Italy, laying the foundations of the modern commercial banking system. It clinked in the purses of merchants in France and Holland, stimulating the spread of commerce and manufacturing. And it paid for much of the burgeoning international trade with Asia, whose sellers had little use for any European good except silver. The islands of the Caribbean Sea, known as the West Indies, served as offshore bases for the staging of the Spanish invasion of the mainland Americas. Here supplies could be stored, and men and horses could be rested and acclimated, before proceeding to the conquest of the continents. The loosely organized and vulnerable native communities of the West Indies also provided laboratories for testing the techniques that would eventually subdue the advanced Indian civilizations of Mexico and Peru. The most important subjugation technique was the institution known as the encomienda. It allowed the government to command, or give, Indians to certain colonists in return for the promise to try to Christianize them. In all but name, it was slavery. Spanish missionary Bartolomé de las Casas, appalled by the encomienda system in Hispaniola, called it a moral pestilence invented by Satan. Tonight, Gabrielle René will take an in-depth look at the conquest of Mexico, by Hernán Cortés.
In 1519 Hernán Cortés set sail from Cuba, with 16 fresh horses and several hundred men aboard 11 ships, bound for Mexico and for destiny. On the island of Cozumel off the Yucatan Peninsula, he rescued a Spanish castaway who had been enslaved for several years by the Mayan-speaking Indians. A short distance farther on, he picked up the female Indian slave Malinche, who knew both Mayan and Nahuatl, the language of the powerful Aztec rulers of the great empire in the highlands of central Mexico. In addition to his superior firepower, Cortés now had the advantage, through these two interpreters, of understanding the speech of the native peoples whom he was about to encounter, including the Aztecs. Malinche eventually learned Spanish and was baptized with the Spanish name of Doña Marina. Near present-day Veracruz, Cortés made his final landfall. Through his interpreters he learned of unrest within the Aztec Empire among the peoples from whom the Aztecs demanded tribute. He also heard alluring tales of the gold and other wealth stored up in the legendary Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. He lusted to tear open the coffers of the Aztec kingdom. To quell his mutinous troops, he boldly burned his ships, cutting off any hope of retreat. Gathering a force of some 20,000 Indian allies, he marched on Tenochtitlan. As Cortés proceeded, the Aztec chieftain Moctezuma sent ambassadors bearing fabulous gifts to welcome the approaching Spaniards. These only whetted the conquerors' appetites. "We Spanish suffer from a strange disease of the heart," Cortés allegedly informed the emissaries, "for which the only known remedy is gold." The ambassadors reported this comment to Moctezuma, along with the astonishing fact that the newcomers rode on the backs of giant deer, horses. The superstitious Moctezuma also believed that Cortés was the god Quetzalcoatl, whose return from the eastern sea was predicted in Aztec legends. Expectant yet apprehensive, Moctezuma allowed the conquerors to approach his capital unopposed. As the Spaniards entered the Valley of Mexico, the sight of the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan amazed them. With 300,000 inhabitants spread over 10 square miles, it rivaled in size and pomp any city in contemporary Europe. The Aztec metropolis rose from an island in the center of the lake, surrounded by floating gardens of extraordinary beauty. It was connected to the mainland by a series of causeways and supplied with fresh water by an artfully designed aqueduct. Moctezuma treated Cortés hospitably at first, but soon the Spaniards' hunger for gold and power exhausted their welcome. They thirsted mightily for gold, they stuffed themselves with it, they starved for it, they lusted for it like pigs, said one Aztec. On the Noche Triste sad night of June 30, 1520, the Aztecs attacked, driving the Spanish down the causeways from Tenochtitlan in a frantic, bloody retreat. Cortés then laid siege to the city, and it capitulated on August 13, 1521. That same year a smallpox epidemic burned through the Valley of Mexico. The combination of conquest and disease took a grisly toll. The Aztec Empire gave way to 3 centuries of Spanish rule. The temples of Tenochtitlan were destroyed to make way for the Christian cathedrals of Mexico City, built on the site of the ruined Aztec capital. And the native population of Mexico, winnowed mercilessly by the invaders' diseases, shrank from some 20 million to 2 million people in less than a century. Yet the Spanish invaders brought more than conquest and death. The Spanish brought their crops and their animals, their language and their laws, their customs and their religion, all of which the peoples of Mexico were encouraged and coerced into adopting. To this day Mexican civilization remains a unique blend of the old world and the new, producing both ambivalence and pride among people of Mexican heritage. Reporting for the Historytellers, I'm Gabrielle Renee.
The spread of Spanish America was swift and often without remorse. In our final segment tonight, James Marshall will detail how Spain's colonial empire grew swiftly and impressively.
Within about half a century of Columbus's landfall, hundreds of Spanish cities and towns flourished in the Americas, especially in the great silver-producing centers of Peru and Mexico. Some 160,000 Spaniards, mostly men, had subjugated millions of the native population. Majestic cathedrals dotted the land, printing presses turned out books, and scholars studied at distinguished universities including those at Mexico City and Lima, Peru, both founded in 1551, 85 years before Harvard, the first college, established in the English colonies. But how secure were these imperial possessions? Other powers were already sniffing around the edges of the Spanish domain, eager to bite off their share of the promised wealth of the new lands. The upstart English sent John Cabot to explore the northeastern coast of North America in 1497 and 1498. The French king dispatched another Italian mariner, Giovanni da Verrazzano, to probe the eastern seaboard in 1524. 10 years later the Frenchman Jacques Cartier journeyed hundreds of miles up the St. Lawrence River to secure the northern periphery of their New World domain against such encroachments and to convert more Indian souls to Christianity. The Spanish began to fortify and settle their North American borderlands. In a move to block French ambitions and to protect the sea lanes to the Caribbean, the Spanish erected a fortress at St. Augustine, Florida, in 1565, thus founding the oldest continually inhabited European settlement in the future United States. In Mexico, the tales of Coronado's expedition of the 1540s to the upper Rio Grande and Colorado River regions continued to beckon the Spanish interest northward. A dust-begrimed expeditionary column, with 83 rumbling wagons, and hundreds of grumbling men, traversed the bare Sonora Desert from Mexico into the Rio Grande Valley in 1598. Led by Don Juan de Onate, the Spaniards cruelly abused the Pueblo peoples they encountered. In the Battle of Acoma in 1599, the Spanish severed one foot of each survivor. They proclaimed the area to be the province of New Mexico in 1609, and founded its capital at Santa Fe the following year. The Spanish settlers in New Mexico found a few furs and precious little gold, but they did discover a wealth of souls to be harvested for the Christian religion. The Roman Catholic mission became the central institution in colonial New Mexico until the missionaries' efforts to suppress native religious customs provoked an Indian uprising, called Pope's Rebellion, in 1680. The Pueblo rebels destroyed every Catholic church in the province, and killed a score of priests and hundreds of Spanish settlers. In a reversal of Cortez's treatment of the Aztec temples, more than a century earlier, the Indians rebuilt Chiquiva, or ceremonial religious chamber, on the ruins of the Spanish plaza at Santa Fe. It took nearly half a century for the Spanish fully to reclaim New Mexico from the insurrectionary Indians. Meanwhile, as a further hedge against the ever-threatening French, who had sent an expedition under Robert de La Salle down the Mississippi River in the 1680s, the Spanish began around 1716 to establish settlements in Texas. Some refugees from the Pueblo uprising trickled into Texas, and a few missions were established there, including the one at San Antonio later, known as the Alamo. But for at least another century, the Spanish presence remained weak in this distant northeastern outpost of Spain's Mexican Empire. To the west, in California, no serious foreign threat loomed, and Spain directed its attention there only belatedly. Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo had explored the California coast in 1542, but he failed to find San Francisco Bay or anything else of much interest. For some 2 centuries thereafter, California slumbered undisturbed by European intruders. Then in 1769, Spanish missionaries led by Father Junipero Serra founded at San Diego, the first of a chain of 21 missions that wound up the coast as far as Sonoma, north of San Francisco Bay. Father Serra's brown-robed Franciscan friars toiled with zealous devotion to Christianize the 300,000 native Californians. They gathered the semi-nomadic Indians into fortified missions and taught them horticulture and basic crafts. These mission Indians did adopt Christianity, but they also lost contact with their native cultures and often lost their lives as well, as the white man's diseases doomed these biologically vulnerable peoples. The misdeeds of the Spanish in the New World obscured their substantial achievements and helped give birth to the Black Legend. This concept held that the conquerors merely tortured and butchered the native peoples, stole their gold, infected them with smallpox, and left little but misery behind. The Spanish invaders did indeed kill, enslave, and infect countless natives, but they also erected a colossal empire, sprawling from California and Florida to Tierra del Fuego. They grafted their culture, laws, religion, and language onto a wide array of native societies, laying the foundations for a score of Spanish-speaking nations. All of it built on a sea of blood and bones and creating a roadmap for other European countries to follow. Clearly, the Spaniards, who had more than a century's head start over the English, were genuine empire builders and cultural innovators in the New World. As compared with their northern European rivals, their colonial establishment was larger and richer, and it was destined to endure more than a quarter of a century longer. Depending on your point of view, you could say that the Spanish paid the Native Americans the high compliment of fusing with them, through marriage, and incorporating indigenous culture into their own. Although, one must wonder, if given the choice, how willingly many of the native peoples wanted their culture so radically changed. However, in contrast, the English would shun, and eventually isolate the native peoples, while still seeking ways to coerce them into submission. For the Historytellers, I'm James Marshall.
Thank you, James. This concludes our three-part series on the beginnings of the New World. Stay tuned for more episodes of the Historytellers, as we explore the history of the United States, with the planting of English America. For the Historytellers, I'm Jason Calvert. Be safe, and stay alert for wonder.